Good afternoon. I'm Larry Horton, president of the Stanford Historical Society, and I welcome you to this program on the history of anesthesia at Stanford. The Stanford Historical Society will celebrate its 50th anniversary next year. The Stanford Historical Society is a volunteer organization dedicated to preservation and understanding of Stanford history from its founding until the present day. We do that by programs and publications on Stanford history. Two examples of our publications are a scholarly book on the presidency of Wallace Stirling, the man who moved the Stanford Hospital Medical School from San Francisco to the main campus, and that was a major factor in Stanford's rise to the top ranks of research universities in America. And we also publish a magazine, comes out 3 times a year, Sandstone and Tile, and members always get a copy. You can find out more information about the society on the website, and you may wish to become a member, support our work, and learn more about Stanford history. After today's program, we're going to have refreshments in the lobby, and you will find members of the society out there willing to talk to you. Of course, because of the importance of the School of Medicine in Stanford's history, over the years, we've had many programs about the medical school and the hospital. 2 examples are a 1997 lecture on the history of heart transplantation by Norman Shumway, and Dean Phil Pizzo's 2009 lecture on 100 years of medicine at Stanford. Today, I think you will enjoy and learn a lot from this program on the history of anesthesia at Stanford. Our speaker this afternoon will be introduced by Dr. Brian Bateman, the chairman of Stanford's Department of Anesthesiology, Perioperative, and Pain Medicine. Dr. Bateman was appointed chairman in 2021. He came west after distinguished service in leadership positions in the same specialties at Harvard Medical School and at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. He is actively involved today in Washington government's agencies for research in medicine. He's the editor of a journal on anesthesiology and the author of many articles and a textbook. Dr. Bateman is yet another example of Stanford's recruiting policy. Find the very best person wherever they are and do whatever you can to bring them here. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Bateman.
So thank you, Larry, for that very kind introduction. And now it's my honor to introduce Jay Brodsky, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Anesthesiology, Perioperative, and Pain Medicine. Like me, Jay joined Stanford after training in Boston. He joined the faculty here in 1977 and went on to have a really storied 45-year career in the department. He served for nearly 2 decades as chief of the multi-specialty division, which is the largest division in the Department of Anesthesiology, overseeing all of the general OR cases, transplant cases, thoracics, and so forth. Jay was known to be just an exceptional clinician, the person you really turn to for the most complex cases and the most challenging patients. He's also a prolific scholar, authoring over 100 articles in various areas of relevance to clinical anesthesia, including obesity and airway management. Since becoming an emeritus faculty member, he's written multiple books now on the history of the Department of Anesthesiology, and so I think there's really no better person to present to us on the proud history of the department. Thank you very much, Jay.
Thank you, Brian. I want to first start by thanking the Larry Horton and the History Society, Stanford Historical Society. I want to thank Dean Lloyd Minor and this medical school, and I want to thank Brian Bateman and the Department of Anesthesia for supporting this talk. Today's talk, I'd like to concentrate on the early history of Stanford anesthesia. The pioneers, so to speak, who created a department that today is probably one of the best, if not best, anesthesia departments in the country. I'm not a historian, I don't claim to be. I'm a clinical anesthesiologist, but COVID and then early retirement at the age of 75 gave me the opportunity to pursue other interests. And like so many other members of the department, I wasn't familiar with some of the names, some of the great names who were there before us. And so that became my hobby. Now, Dean of the medical school at the time, Phil Pizzo, gave a wonderful talk, and I really recommend it to anybody interested in the history of Stanford Medical School. Wonderful talk, but he concentrated on the research and academic and teaching aspects of the early history of the department. He basically didn't have much to say about clinical anesthesia at Stanford. In fact, he quoted someone as saying that the reputation for Stanford clinical medicine gets better the further you get away from Stanford. So I don't exactly agree with that. And I hope to show you today some of the achievements, really unique achievements that Stanford anesthesiologists made prior to and during the move to Palo Alto. So can you imagine surgery without anesthesia? You know, it really can't be done. Anesthesia provides a pain-free experience for a surgical procedure, and if you choose, for obstetrical deliveries. But it's not always been that way. These two lovely women are my maternal great-grandmothers. The reason I show their photos is because they grew up, they were born in a time when there was no anesthesia for surgery. Only four generations separate them from me. Only 6 generations separate them from my grandchildren. It's been a short period of time. Prior to that, for surgery, the surgeons were limited. They couldn't do many operations. They did amputations and teeth removals and superficial operations, but they really couldn't do much in the way of operative procedures. The patient felt pain, had to be restricted, physically restricted. It's been less than 200 years since anesthesia has been available. That great moment came in October 16th, 1846, when this man, a dentist, William Horton, made a demonstration at the Mass General Hospital of ether for anesthesia. The surgeon, John Warren, the patient, Glenn Abbott, had a tumor removed from the neck, and they both sailed through the procedure painlessly. The surgeon turned to the dumbfounded, awestruck students that were in the audience, and he said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." For those of you unfamiliar with Victorian slang, a humbug is a flagrant pretense used in the 19th century to play a trick on unsuspecting people. This was a real great breakthrough by a dentist. Mass General now, this is what the operating room would have looked like in 1846. This is a painting. They've immortalized the moment. Postage stamps have been issued with Morton's portrait and with the scene in the Mass General Hospital. And today, for those of you who've been to Boston, at man's greatest hospital, the MGH, there's a shrine, the Ether Dome, for that great moment in 1846. On Morton's tombstone, it says, "Inventor and revealer of anesthetic inhalation." The problem is, across the city in another cemetery in Boston, there's this tombstone, and this is from Charles Thomas Jackson, a physician. And I'm not going to read it, but it says he invented ether anesthesia. So what's going on here? This led to what's called the ether controversy, the Great Ether Controversy. In 1845, Morton, who was a dentist, was at the demonstration by his partner, Horace Well, and other dentists, of the use of nitrous oxide for anesthesia, and it failed. The patient wasn't anesthetized. It was a bad experience. Later in 1846, that Charles Jackson actually suggested to Morton that he use ether for a dental extraction, which he did. And so the following month, the great moment arrived in October 46, when he demonstrated the successful use of ether for surgery. Now, Morton and Jackson applied shortly thereafter together for a patent. They got US patent 4848. They called their new invention lithium, but everybody knew it was basically ether, and they made no money out of this. So Morton applied to the US government for what he called national recompense. He wanted $100,000 for his great invention. And of course, Jackson and Wells also applied. They were all denied. Now, think of it, this is before Doge. This is the man who the first demonstrated ether anesthesia. His name is Crawford Long. He was a surgeon in rural Georgia. And 4 years earlier, he had used ether for removal of the tumor. And here's the only photograph of him working. He's doing the amputation. He continued to use ether anesthesia throughout his career, and he continued after 1842 to use ether for surgeries and obstetrics. The reason he doesn't get credit is that he published his work in the Southern Medical and Surgical Journal, and all the physicians in the audience know that unless you publish it in some kind of New England journal, it doesn't get read. But he did get his own postage stamp, this one from the United States in 1940. So he was recognized as the founder of ether anesthesia. Now, what is ether anesthesia? You have a bottle container of liquid ether, and you have a mask that you put over the patient's face, and you fill that mask with cotton or gauze, anything that can absorb fluids, and you basically drip ether on the cotton, and the patient breathes it in. Now, what could be simpler than that? I mean, ether anesthesia is incredibly simple to administer. Nurses, orderly, medical students, even surgeons could do it. Let's just go across the country, leave Boston and come to San Francisco. In 1858, Ohio physician Samuel Ellis Cooper, came to San Francisco and opened the first medical school. In 1858, he named that the medical department of the University of the Pacific. Unfortunately, he died the following year. Before he died, his nephew, Levi Cooper Lane, came to San Francisco, joined him in the medical department of the Pacific, and then left because the school basically floundered without the founder. And they went to Toland Medical School, which later became UCSF, the second medical school in San Francisco. Things didn't go well for him there, and he returned and reopened Cooper School in 1872, calling it the Medical College of the Pacific, and he changed that name in 1882 to Cooper Medical School. In 1895, using his own funds, he built this Cooper Medical College, the Cooper Hospital, Lane Hospital, excuse me. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a gentleman there with a white beard at the lower center of the picture, and that's Cooper Lane operating. The problem was no antisepsis, no isolation. You can see anybody could crowd in. If you've seen Seinfeld, you know it could have disastrous effects. In 1896, this woman, Mary Botsford, graduated from Holland Medical School, later UCSF, and 2 years later, she devoted her practice entirely to anesthesiology. And she's believed to be the first person in the United States to become a specialist, a full-time anesthetist. She joined the UCSF faculty. She actually was a big supporter of anesthesia and had the California legislature mandate that all medical students had to do at least 10 anesthetics during the course of their medical education before they could go out there and drop the ether on the patient. And she retired as a clinical professor of anesthesia at UCSF. Now, the reason why this is important is this woman, Carolyn Palmer. She was a graduate of Cooper Medical School, and she went to study with with Botsford. And she became interested in anesthesiology and returned to Cooper Medical School in 1907 to join the faculty. Well, at the time, the dean at Cooper Medical School, Henry Gibbons, needed a head of anesthesia. And so he asked and invited Carolyn Palmer to become the head of the anesthesia department. So you ask, anyone can do anesthesia. Anyone in this audience could be taught to do ether anesthesia. Why do you need a head of anesthesia? So this is now one of the major early contributions of Stanford anesthesiologists. Besides being a woman in the first chair of anesthesia at what became Stanford, she published her reasons why you need a head and how to organize a hospital with appropriate services for maximum efficiency. She published this in one of our main journals, Anesthesia and Analgesia, over 100 years ago. And all the points that she made are as important now as they were 100 years ago. And I'll just read them. First of all, she insisted on physician-only anesthesiology. As I said, orderlies walking in a hall would be called to do anesthesia. She said, physician-only, well-trained anesthesiologists should provide anesthesia for both elective and emergency cases. Her second point was that the experience of the anesthesiologist should meet the challenge. So obviously, if you had a real complex case, you want a more experienced anesthesiologist. Her third point was to ask for reasonable compensation for members of the department. I always felt this should be the first point, but she said that somebody should be available to ensure that all the apparatus is in perfect condition and available. You don't want to find an instrument or a piece of equipment missing in the middle of a case. And somebody to check that the supplies are also available and to avoid waste. Again, this is a very important point in today's practice of medicine. She had the audacity to say that the anesthesiologist, the anesthetist, they call them, should actually meet with the patient ahead of time and learn something about the patient. So he could actually talk with the surgeon and they can plan out together the appropriate management, and that they should meet with the nurses, the surgeon, and the anesthetist should continue the care preoperatively, intraoperatively, and postoperatively, work as a team. She insisted on obstetrical anesthesia services at Stanford Lane Hospital. And she felt that the specialty needed to progress and evolve. And she encouraged new innovations, and also was one of the first to have actually an anesthetic record and give it to the hospital. So this is for quality assurance. It's way ahead of its time. So Carolyn Palmer, and these are photographs from the Stanford archives. And you can see there's a woman in the middle, but they don't name her. But I believe these are photographs of Carolyn Palmer. She retired in 1937 as an emeritus clinical professor of surgery. Remember, anesthesia was a division of surgery. It was not an independent department. It was part of surgery. She retired as an emeritus professor. Meanwhile, in 1901, this man, David Starr Jordan, who was the president of Stanford University, met with the Levi Cooper Lane to discuss the merger of Stanford and his medical school. Unfortunately, he died the following year, and it took 7 years before the board of directors at Cooper Medical College and Stanford merged. And they called the merger the Medical Department of Stanford University. Now, what many don't realize is that the two schools overlapped for 4 years. Even though they decided to merge, Cooper had to graduate its already enrolled students, and Stanford started matriculating their students. So it really only became a single entity in 1914 with Ray Lyman Wilbur as the dean, and they changed the name to Stanford School of Medicine, the name that continues. 1917, the original Stanford Hospital was built in San Francisco. And it actually was, I don't have a pointer, but it was adjoining, that's Lane Hospital, and that's Stanford Hospital. They were joined together, and it became Stanford Lane Hospital. After Stanford moved, it became the site of Presbyterian Hospital and is now the site of California Pacific Medical Center. But the two hospitals were together. Well, Palmer was replaced by this man, William Neff. William Neff was a graduate of Hahnemann University, which is a homeopathic school. So I always wondered why homeopathy, which depends on the use of natural substances like minerals and plants in lieu of conventional medicine, why he chose anesthesiology, because we use so many drugs, not based on plants. But that's Neff. He was actually, as a resident, was part of the first paper on an alternative to ether, cyclopropane. So he's a co-author with Ralph Waters, who's there in the photograph with Neff for cyclopropane. And he, in 1937, had succeeded Carolyn Palmer as chair of anesthesia at Stanford. And he held that role until 1950. And Neff was an innovator and contributor also. I think his major contribution was he established the first residency for physician anesthesiologists in California, the very first in 1937. UCLA, USC followed years later, and UCSF attempted in the 1940s to have an anesthesia residency, but they failed, and they didn't become active until the early 50s. So besides the teaching aspect of new residents, he was an innovator and built a recorder for heart rate and for blood pressure. He described balanced anesthesia where you use nitrous oxide, oxygen, and a muscle relaxant, and a narcotic, an opioid, instead of ether, because ether is flammable, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And surgeons wanted to be able to cauterize to stop bleeding by burning the blood vessels, and you can't do that with ether. And he described pre-oxygenation. You can imagine, for the anesthesiologist in the audience, doing an anesthetic without giving supplemental oxygen, at least at the start. And he was the first to describe that. So Stanford, I was asked some questions prior in some of the major watershed moments. One of them, I believe, was the use of physician-only anesthesiologists to make it a truly specialized branch of medicine. And as you can see in the picture, they're mostly women. Why? Why were they mostly women? In fact, they were almost entirely women. Well, the surgeon, Alton Ochsner, from the Ochsner Clinic in New Orleans, wrote this in a paper in 1920. The best anesthetics are conducted by women because it is possible to select women with the highest degree of intelligence and judgment for this work, while medical men possessing these qualities can almost never be induced to elect anesthesia as a specialty. Kind of sexist. But that all changed. I put here the faculty for Stanford anesthesia during Neff's chairmanship, 1936 to 45. And then after, his first recruit was a co-resident who had worked with him, John Stiles. But you can see all the people who joined the faculty afterwards were men. And that's because during World War II, when a physician went in the military, they were assigned to do anesthesia. Remember, anybody could do it. And the soldiers returning home found that they really enjoyed the work of an anesthesiologist. And they went and did residencies, and they were recruited. So the all-women anesthesia teams changed to include many, many men after the Second World War. Okay, we're almost here at Stanford Anesthesia in Palo Alto. In 1959, the dean, Alway, and Wallace Sterling, the president of Stanford University, decided to move the medical school to the campus here in Palo Alto. And they had an image for the new medical school. They wanted it to be basically research-oriented and academically oriented. And they couldn't find a chairman for anesthesia. They invited none of the clinicians, at least none of the anesthesiologists in San Francisco, to come down to the new campus. In fact, there were 4 residents training in anesthesiology at that time, and they had to complete their residencies in San Francisco, UCSF, because they were not invited down. And so initially in 1959 to 60, there was no anesthesia at all here at Stanford. They were looking for a head of anesthesia, and nobody would come because they didn't want to work as a division of the Department of Surgery. So finally, they gave in 1960, and they recruited this fellow, John Bunker from Harvard, from Mass General as the chair of the first department of anesthesiology, independent department at Stanford. And the initial department was very small. There was bunker. There were 3, what I call academic faculty, who were basically hired to do research. And there were 3 clinical faculty, very small department. Okay, getting back to ether, you can see between 1846 and the introduction of halothane, the first modern anesthetic in 1956, 110 years passed. Ether was simple to administer, but it caused nausea, vomiting, and worst of all, it was flammable, so you can't use electric cautery. So in 56, halothane was introduced and began to replace ether. The problem was that very shortly after halothane was introduced, they began to have reports of liver failure following administration, somebody having an operation with halothane. And the story goes that in 1962, this is the year after bunker started, a pathologist called him and said, "What's going on here?" He had a young girl, a 16-year-old girl, who died of liver failure 2 weeks after receiving a halothane anesthetic for a very, very minor operation. And her case, along with the other cases, caused the National Academy of Sciences to contact Stanford, contact Bunker, and asked they funded a research program to look at halothane hepatitis. I had, and my colleague John Brodsky had the pleasure of interviewing 96-year-old Bill Forrest yesterday, who gave us some insight into the National Halothane Study. But basically, it was a study to look and see if people were really dying after halothane. And so it compared halothane hepatitis, healthy livers, and liver failure patients. And it looked at 856,000 operations across the country at 34 hospitals over a 4-year period. And unfortunately, they couldn't show that halothane caused hepatitis. There were only 82 cases out of that 856,000 where patients who died of liver failure died for unknown reasons. Could have been halothane hepatitis, could have been another reason. They just couldn't tell. There's no diagnostic histologic slide that the pathologist can look at and say this is halothane hepatitis. The number of halothane deaths or the number of hepatitis deaths were too small to even associate halothane with hepatitis. But what they did find, that halothane was actually safer than all the other anesthetics that are being used. If you had a halothane anesthetic, it was safer. You had less mortality. It also found that the total number of deaths from the same operation varied between hospitals. Remember, this looked at 20 hospitals, and they said if you controlled for patient, type of operation, medical conditions, there was a wide range of mortality post-op. Some hospitals had far less than others. And this ushered in I think this is the main contribution of the National Halothane Study. It ushered in a new era of quality improvement, quality outcome studies. Why is there such a difference between hospitals? So the National Halothane Study, which was performed here basically by Bill Forrest at Stanford Medical School, was a landmark study not only in anesthesiology, but in computer statistics. It's probably the largest study to that date that ever used computers to analyze data. And it also started health science research. So that's one of the watershed moments, in my opinion, in Stanford anesthesia. Bill also did other studies at the VA, where he was the only anesthesiologist, and then moved to Stanford in 1971, and he opened the Center for Healthcare Research. And again, it was looking at these differences between hospitals as far as mortality. And it was actually, again, supported by funds that were, believe it or not, left over from the National Halothane Study. Again, you can imagine what DOGE would do with that. It found there was a difference between hospitals and outcomes. And to this day, you know, there's still populates outcome studies among hospitals. But again, Bill Forrest in anesthesia was the key investigator. Anybody in the audience have surgery within the last 20 years? You know, you have now a device. There, we have somebody. We have a device called a PCA, patient-controlled analgesia. You can push a button and it delivers pain medicine in your intravenous line. You don't have to wait to see if the nurse does or not answer your need for help. Well, Bill Forrest actually developed the first patient-controlled analgesic device, called it the Demand Drop Master. Unfortunately, and we brought it up yesterday in our interview, he never capitalized on this, so he's still living on Social Security. So between 1846 and 1956, it was 110 years. The next inhalation anesthetic was methoxyflurane. It was introduced just 4 years later after halothane was introduced because people were afraid of halothane hepatitis. And Dick Mazie was another Stanford anesthesiologist. He was sponsored by Abbott Laboratories to show that methoxyflurane is the best anesthetic. Replace halothane. It was non-inflammable and you didn't get hepatitis. Unfortunately for Abbott, he discovered that methoxyflurane actually did cause a disease. It caused renal failure, high output renal failure. It was metabolized to inorganic fluoride, and unlike halothane hepatitis, where there was no cause and effect, he was able to show that the metabolism of methoxyflurane caused renal failure. And so this was reviewed in a classic article in our journal, Anesthesiology, and I show it because I love the title, Methoxyflurane, A Tale of an Anesthetic from Cradle to Grave. Abbott absolutely regretted hiring him because the methoxyflurane was no longer used. I only show this because in my brief career, I worked with halothane, methoxyflurane, enflurane, isoflurane, desflurane, and now sevoflurane. And sevoflurane is the commonly used drug now, but you can see it's been over 30 years. We haven't had a new one. We can talk about that later, but that's basically the evolution of inhalation anesthetics. So one of the first recruits that Bunker hired was this man, John Belleville. And J. Belleville was truly a Renaissance man. He was an anesthesiologist, did cases. He was a clinical pharmacologist. He was an engineer. I mentioned that he was a computer scientist and did the data analysis for the National Halothane Study, and he did basic science research. One of his colleagues in the School of Engineering said, quote, J. Belleville was the first to apply engineering principles such as computer signals to operating room monitoring. Now everything, if you go in an operating room now, everything's monitored and on a display in a computer. He developed the first brain monitor for EEG monitoring for depth of anesthesia. We have that now, it's called a BIS monitor. It's used pretty universally. He developed servo mechanisms for delivery of anesthetic agents. Again, target-controlled infusions are based on a lot of his theories. He also fooled around with computers. He published a textbook called Technology, Techniques in Clinical Physiology in 1969. It was pretty well received, except one reviewer in the British Journal of Anesthesia wrote, the book puts too much emphasis, 25%, on computers, on the very limited application of computers in medicine. So J. Belleville was probably 10 years ahead of the rest of the anesthesia world at Stanford. This is my hero, Ellis Cone. Ellis Cone, I only show his slide here to show that he, like so many others, was sent off to the war. He was a battalion and regimental surgeon. He won 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and a Silver Star for bravery. And he was the man I started working with in 1977 when I came to Stanford. He was my mentor. Prior to that, he had done other outstanding work. He identified the site of action of the muscle relaxing curare, where it worked. And he also identified an impurity in halothane that he felt and his coworkers felt was the cause of halothane hepatitis. And the makers actually cleaned it up and removed the impurity. If I can pronounce it, dichlorohexyl butane, but it's gone. This is what Ellis Cone looked like in '77 when I arrived. And what he's really known for is his work with occupational exposure to anesthesia. Anyone working in an operating room in the '70s would go home with headaches, nausea. You'd breathe the same gases that the patient had breathed out into the room, into the ambient atmosphere. And Ellis Cone did numerous studies looking at the association between health risks, particularly reproductive problems in women exposed to inhalation anesthetics and waste anesthetic gases. It's an association. He never proved a cause and effect, but he and I collaborated with him, did studies on large databases to show there was a higher incidence of some of these problems for people who worked in the operating room. He published 2 books, The Anesthetic Exposure in the Workplace and Metabolism of Volatile Anesthetics, the implications for toxicity. And this has caused NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, to put guidelines, limits on how much gas can be spilled into the atmosphere for workers. And here he is with Chuck Witcher, who we'll get to in a moment, but they identify these potential health risks. Stanford became the very first hospital in the world to start collecting these waste anesthetic gases and preventing the workers from being exposed. And now scavenging, the removal of waste anesthetic gases, is practiced basically in every hospital in the world, but Stanford was the first. Chuck Witcher, he was the clinician of the small department. He was hired basically to do the cases, although he worked a lot with doing monitoring in the operating room. He was appointed in '61 and promoted in '67. Because this is a Stanford audience, I want to show that he was promoted to associate clinical professor and senior attending physician. He's probably the only one in the medical school who ever had the title senior attending physician. And the reason for that is he wanted to buy a house on campus, and they didn't let clinicians buy houses then. So they created a title for him so he could go out and buy his house, which he did. So he was the only senior attending physician that I know of. Everybody in the audience know this picture. Christian Bernard got credit for doing the first heart transplant in December 1967. This is the man, obviously, who should have gotten the credit, Norman Shumway. And I'm pleased to see Dr. Reitz, who's one of the successors in cardiac surgery at Stanford, here in the audience. Norman Shumway had worked for years doing studies, 10 years of research experiments on animals with heart transplantation. In November 20th, '67, he announced that he was now ready to do a human. He had to find the right donor, the right recipient, but he felt ready to do the case. Bernard ran ahead. Bernard had observed at Stanford, had observed transplant techniques here. So he ran back to South Africa. And shortly after Shumway announced his November 20th date, he performed the first human transplant on December 1967 and became famous, as world famous, whereas Shumway should have gotten the credit. Norm Shumway didn't do the first transplant until a couple of weeks later in January 1968. Now, how did he get that transplant done? This is a book by Bunker, the chairman, talking about the anesthesiologist and the surgeon, partners in the operating room. And there's Bunker, and there's Shumway. Bunker was the main obstacle for doing the transplant. Bunker was against it. Bunker felt that if you take a beating heart out of a patient, by definition, that's murder. And he felt that the district attorney would indict anyone associated with the first transplant with murder because you're removing a beating heart. And Bunker supported that. He asked for volunteers to do the first transplant, and there's our Chuck Witcher. Chuck Witcher came forward, was the anesthesiologist on the recipient of the first transplant. And in the newspaper article, they said the donor was anesthetized by Kenneth Janis. Kenneth Janis was a resident because Bunker took credit for it, but Bunker, I don't believe, was even present. I don't know. And here's a picture of the first transplant, January 6th, 1968. Well, in the audience was this man. This is Sam Beltran. Now, Beltran was being recruited to Stanford as a cardiac anesthesiologist to work with Shumway and the cardiac team. And he was in the audience, or he was in the operating room during the first transplant, but really was not involved. And Bunker became the first director of the ICU at Stanford. The ICU was Norm Shumway's post-cardiac patients. But in a personal communication to my colleague, John Brockutney, who's in the audience, Beltran claimed that he was able to convince everyone that brain death, which was a diagnosis already accepted by neurologists, should be accepted in the surgical world, and that you could have brain death and remove a beating heart and not be indicted for murder. So Beltran claimed before he passed away that it was his forceful action that allowed brain death to be accepted. I'm sure everybody in the audience knows what this is. It's a pulse oximeter, right? I mean, nobody can have surgery or nowadays without a pulse oximeter. Well, this is the first pulse oximeter. It was invented by a Japanese engineer named Takuo Oyagi in 1974. And Minolta in Japan built the first pulse oximeter, the Oximet 1471. And they sent this to major hospitals in Japan asking, is this good? And to a hospital, they all said there was no clinical application of pulse oximetry. It was a great research tool, but there was no application. They also, and in fact, a total of only 200 of these 1471s were ever sold in Japan. 200 were only sold. Fortunately for them, they sent also one of these pulse oximeters to Stanford. And here's where Bill New comes in. Bill New is an engineer, a prior MS in electrical engineering, a PhD in electrophysiology. He worked as a medical student with Chuck Witcher, and Witcher used to go around fooling around doing electric monitoring, gas monitoring, and he was impressed, and he decided to go into anesthesiology after medical school. While at Stanford, he worked with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, building computers as a hobby. So he really had a lot of outside interests. But he went on to become an assistant professor in the department, and then got his master's in business from the School of Business. So Rich Novak, who produces the most popular anesthesia podcast, called Bill New the most significant anesthesiologist of the 20th century. And I think he has something there, because without Bill New, perhaps pulse oximetry would not have been as widely accepted as it is now. Bill New launched Nellcore in 1981. He had used it here at Stanford. We felt there was a lot of clinical application for pulse oximetry. The Japanese were wrong for a change. And he built the Nellcore 100. And what made this interesting is it has an audible beep. So the beep changes depending on the level of oxygenation. Pulse oximetry measures the amount of oxygen that's the percentage of oxygen that's physically attached to hemoglobin. Obviously, if it's 100%, that's good. If it's 60%, that's bad. And so Nellcore was ultimately acquired by Mallinckrodt for billions, and it's estimated over 1 billion people a year are using pulse oximeters. Now, some of the anesthesiologists in the audience might not realize that oximetry was not initially accepted by everyone, because oximetry only measures the percent saturation. There's a device called transcutaneous oxygen tension monitoring, which measures the partial pressure in the blood. And that was, anesthesiologists were more used to that measurement, because that was partial pressure of gases was known, and that's how you thought in terms of hypoxia and whatever. And so they actually were competition. And so in 1983, there's a picture of Frank Sonnquist, Christine Todd, and Chuck Witcher, who wrote the first paper on the accuracy of pulse oximetry. There's Mike Flynn, and there's a young Jay Brodsky. We went around the country trying to educate people on the use of oximetry. I, in fact, was funded by NELCOR, and I went to Europe, to Denmark, to Israel, to Taiwan, to teach people about pulse oximetry because nobody knew what it was. And the anesthesiologists, like people in this audience, would line up because we brought one machine with us. And they all just got excited about seeing their oxygen saturation. Because of NELCOR, pulse oximetry became the 5th anesthetic vital sign, along with heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, and temperature. Now, we consider those the 4 major signs. Pulse oximetry became the 5th. And in 1986, the American Society of Anesthesiologists mandated that pulse oximetry or some form of continuous oxygen monitoring should be used on all patients undergoing anesthetics. So again, as far as important advances here at Stanford, we were fundamental in getting pulse oximetry accepted. And now you can get one on Amazon for under $14. I don't get any royalties for showing that. Al Hackle, another early addition to the department. This man was the first dedicated pediatric anesthesiologist at Stanford. This whole practice, pediatrics. He set up the pediatric and neonatal ICUs. He was very involved, not only in Stanford, but California transport, infant transport. He's considered by many the father of pediatric anesthesiology. And he was awarded the American Academy of Pediatrics Robert Smith Lifetime Achievement Award. This is an anesthesiologist, not a pediatrician. And the Pediatric Society honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Here's a picture of Al with an incubator that he designed to transport newborns. There's another important addition to the department. This is George Albright. Now, George Albright was an obstetrical anesthetist, and he was reading about individual cases of women dying after childbirth or dying during childbirth. And he felt that this may be due to the very high concentration of the local anesthetic, bupivacaine, Marcaine, that was used in the epidurals. And he collected a number of these cases and submitted his paper to Anesthesiology, our premier journal, and it was rejected. It goes, you know, when you submit a medical research paper or any kind of paper, it's reviewed by experts, and it was rejected because the scientists reviewing for anesthesiology said this is all anecdotal. There's no evidence for this. So Phil Larson, who we'll meet in a short while, was the editor of Anesthesiology, and he said, I can't publish it as a peer-reviewed paper because it's not reviewed, but publish it as an editorial. So Albright went ahead and Larson published his editorial about cardiac arrest following bupivacaine. This prompted people to look into what he was alleging. And Sal Schneider up in UCSF showed that 0.75% bupivacaine was cardiotoxic in his experimental animals. It's because of Albright's persistence in getting this publicized that probably hundreds of lives were saved, because in 1983, the FDA recommended no use of 0.75% Marcaine in epidurals. And it's all because the attention that Albright brought the public to. And again, he was given tribute in a paper published in Anesthesiology. My sole contribution to this, because Dr. Brodsky insisted, was that there is a disease called malignant hyperthermia. It was first recognized in the 60s, and patients basically burn up and die under anesthesia. And I was fortunate enough, or unfortunate enough, to have a case of malignant hyperthermia, and I gave the patient dantrolene. Dantrolene had yet to be approved by the FDA, but it turned out that it saved the patient's life. It was the first human success reported of dantrolene for malignant hyperthermia. And after that, shortly after that, the FDA approved dantrolene as the drug of choice for malignant hyperthermia. And now, 40 some odd years later, it's still the drug of choice. So another first for Stanford, we first successful malignant hyperthermia. So Bunker said when he arrived, my job at Stanford from the onset was to attract a research-oriented faculty. And you can see his initial department. And when he left in 1972, and you see the department had grown, but there were 8 research associates in that very small department. The department was really focused on research. And time doesn't allow me to go through all the basic research findings that the department did. Ellis Cohn, who I mentioned, became the first anesthesiologist on the Public Health Service Program Awards Committee. This is the pre-run into the NIH. And Stanford became the 3rd department in the country to get grants from the PHS program. And you see, here's a partial list of some of the research grants that Stanford received during Bunker's time here. In fact, Stanford has now become the #1 department in the country in research funding, the highest with NIH awards in 2024, over $16 million, and with total grant support of over $42 million. And Brian probably has updated numbers that are improve on those numbers. But this is all due to the initial work of John Bunker and his colleagues. Stanford also had some impressive clinical contribution, but who was doing the clinical work if most of the full-time faculty were in the research labs? It was these people. We had an appointment acting anesthesia faculty, usually acting assistant professor, fully trained, usually very well-known anesthesiologists came from around the world to spend a year at Stanford. They got their BTA degree. Does anybody know what the BTA degree is? It's Been to America. So these people went on to get to become extremely influential in their various countries, but they did a lot of, if not most of the clinical work at Stanford. The most famous is Michael Cousins, who basically was the father of regional anesthesia for chronic pain management. So Bunker retired in '72 from anesthesia. He was never really interested in anesthesia. He became a visiting professor in the Department of Preventive and Social Medicine at Harvard, returned to Stanford, where he was a professor in the Department of Health Research and Policy. And he published this book, in which he is considered one of the most influential books in medicine. And he reported that surgery in the United States occurred 3 times more often than in the United Kingdom. And he actually said that it could be due to the financial incentives. Obviously, he was not well liked by surgeons in his new role. It's interesting that the cover of the book, again, has a picture of Norm Shumway doing an operation. So despite their differences, Bunker used Shumway's photographs of Shumway on all his books. So at Stanford, surgery was growing. Roy Cohn was there, Norm Shumway, as I mentioned, Harry Oberhelman. There was a need for clinical anesthesia, and Bunker just wasn't delivering. So Phil Larson, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, was hired. Now he became the 2nd chair of anesthesia at Stanford, and he maintained all the excellence that Bunker had created with research and academics and teaching, but he brought in a lot of clinicians to meet the demands, the needs of the hospital. So this 1917, Stanford Lane Hospital. 1959, 300 Pasteur. And 2019, our beautiful hospital on 500 Pasteur Drive. Well, Bunker started with 4 academic anesthesiologists, 3 clinical faculty, and 4 residents. That was the start. These numbers may be outdated by now, but Stanford in 2024 had over 300 faculty, 118 residents, 52 fellows. We did 67,000 cases in Stanford-affiliated hospitals, 30,000 cases at Packard, all the operations at the VA, thousands of deliveries in obstetrics, and we have the largest pain program in the West with 94,000 clinic visits. So with a total annual budget over $230 million, this all started 65 years ago with a very very, very modest beginnings. We owe it all to these people. These are the chairs of the anesthesia department, from Bunker right into Dr. Bateman, who's the current chair. They did a marvelous job. They took a small, clinically insignificant department into, as I said, probably the world-class anesthesia department. Thank you. So I'm available for any questions.
Well, we had one online from Angie Ballou at the University of Kansas. She was asking, in general, what role do you think curiosity has played in leading to all the new approaches at Stanford, and particularly about having young and new people coming in?
Well, I could only say that we've always been interested in pushing the boundaries of respecting anesthesiology as a true medical specialty. It was not recognized as an independent medical specialty by the American Board of Medicine until 1948. So it's relatively new, and that's why I titled this as an emerging specialty, because we continue, as I showed from the grant awards that we have here at Stanford, continually pushing the knowledge and innovation. So yeah, for an old folk like me, that's great to see young people coming over and taking on the torch. Right. Oh, I'm sorry.
Great presentation, and I'm by no means, full disclosure, I'm not in medicine as a profession, but I'm here because I've had to take anesthesia twice for 2 C-sections. And I was very curious to hear that, about the research where you found that chemical was causing pregnancy-related deaths.
Yeah.
Do you know what chemical is being used now?
Well, no, Marcaine's still being used.
Oh, it's just a lower
It's a
concentration.
lower concentration. It's the higher
Thank you.
concentration. If it gets into the bloodstream and you inject the local anesthetic, no, it's not good any anesthetic, but Marcaine in that concentration was particularly bad.
When Cooper Medical College became the Stanford School of Medicine, you said the merger took place gradually as
Over
one
40
school closed and Stanford
over 4
recruited new
years.
students.
Yeah.
So that was around the time, if I remember correctly, the Flexner report came out. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
And do you think that had any influence? Because it sounds like a great deal of improvements in the department occurred
Well, as you know,
simultaneous
Stanford,
with that.
yeah, Dr. McFarland, as you know, because of the Flex report, there are lots of changes in medical education, and I think Stanford, I don't know, I think Stanford University felt that up there in San Francisco, it's just purely clinical. Maybe they were teaching residents, but there was no academic focus or teaching focus. And so maybe that's one of the reasons they brought it down here, or maybe they just wanted to consolidate all the colleges under one umbrella. But they did overlap for 4 years. There were 2 schools. As I said, they had to wait till they graduated all the Cooper students before they could fully become Stanford Medical School. Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, it was known, and anecdotal, if you want to know the true story. When I did a residency a couple of years earlier, we were assigned as residents topics, and I was given the topic of this new disease, malignant hypothermia. So I was familiar with all the basic research. It was only recognized in the 60s, but they had worked with pigs. There's certain swine that develop a form of malignant hypothermia, and they were treated with dantrolene. So when I had my case, I had been familiar, because of the lecture I gave as a resident, with dantrolene. It's used for cerebral palsy. It's a muscle relaxant. It stops the movements. So I knew the hospital had it, and so I called for the dantrolene, and luckily the patient survived.
Very interesting talk. I was wondering, with NIH funding and all their grants and so forth, any idea what's happening with this Doge?
I will defer to the chairman who gave a talk on this, I think, yesterday. So anything I can add?
There's been a lot of confusion at NIH, a slowing of the release of grants, and I think we're waiting to see how this all plays out. Yeah, so it's definitely a time of great concern.
So
Yes.
there's a question about what's become of the women anesthesiologists in the field.
What's become?
Yeah, and since the
It's-
early history.
It's 50-50 or maybe even higher. There may be a slightly higher percentage of women going into anesthesiology. But it was monopolized by women until the end of World War II. All the returning veterans found that, like I did, that anesthesiology is the career for them. And that's why the big influx.
Yeah, there's a question actually specifically for you. They're wondering what made you choose anesthesiology over psychiatry?
Well, over psychiatry, I'd be afraid to be self-analyzed.
And
My
there was-
daughter's here. She could confirm that. Why I chose anesthesiology, because I think anesthesiology incorporates everything. First of all, you're an acute physician, an internist. You have to be familiar with all diseases. You're then taking a patient and you're subjecting them to an insult, anesthesia, drug. You have to maintain their vital signs. You have to make sure nothing goes wrong. And most importantly, you have to wake them up. Anybody can put them to sleep. That's waking up is why you spend 3 years as a resident. So I found it the most interesting specialty.
Thank you for that great talk.
Thank you.
I'm curious, given your argument about the importance of anesthesia, why did it take so long for it to become a specialty until 1948?
Well, it was always under it was always a division of surgery. And in fact, when I was in the military at Letterman Hospital, 73 to 75 in the Army, it was still a division of surgery. And the chief was a surgeon. And so I was told as an anesthesiologist, you better listen to what he wants rather than what's best for the patient. And I had some interactions. I think to everybody's advantage, when it became an independent specialty, one could practice better medicine. Yes.
Yeah, I think you partially answered the last question. But over the course of decades in anesthesiology, what would be your advice to younger anesthesiologists on dealing with, surgeons?
This is from a surgeon that we have lots of problems. My advice is exactly how I practice. You become a team. You work with the people. There's no captain of the ship like in the past. At one time, I can understand why the surgeon was considered the captain of the ship. Anesthesia was being done by everybody, orderlies. People in the hallway come in and drop the ether. So you need a leader. And so they got this mentality that they're captain of the ship. Well, none of the complex surgical procedures that you can do now, you couldn't do without the evolution of anesthesia. And it's in cardiac anesthesia. It's in all surgical subspecialties. And so we want to be considered an equal member of the team. And I worked, as some of you know, with Jim Marker, who was a thoracic surgeon for most of my career, and we felt we were a team. He wasn't my captain. We were co-physicians caring for the same patient.
Decades ago, a friend of mine went into anesthesia, and he said there's an adage in anesthesia that it's 99% boredom and 1% terror, and he says that's wrong. It's 99.9% utter boredom and 0.1% sheer terror. Can you comment on that?
All I can comment is that I must be a really poor anesthesiologist because I didn't manage to put anybody to sleep today. It depends. It depends on your practice. It depends on what you want to do. I mean, I stayed at Stanford because I like the challenging cases. I like to do the liver resections and the major thoracic cases. If you just want to have a day job, you can go do simple outpatient, healthy patients, and probably be bored. So it depends on what kind of practice you get into, and I certainly didn't have 99% of my time boredom, but it can be at times.
You've described a lot of cross-disciplinary work with very positive outcomes. It also sounds like there haven't been any big changes in the chemical types of products used lately. Who contributes the chemical innovations?
Well, no, well, when you say chemical, there's been lots of changes in local anesthetics and sedative drugs and analgesics. You know, I mean, I just talked about inhalation anesthesia. There's been a hiatus in introducing anesthesia because they have to be produced by a drug company, a pharmaceutical company. And do you know what it costs to test new drugs and then price them? Why would you replace an anesthetic that works perfectly well like sevoflurane, which one that may be a little better, but costs 10 times as much? So there's no economic force driving it. Halothane was metabolized, methoxyflurane was metabolized. They had side effects. Some of them were not as easy to induce by breathing. They cause irritation. You know, sevoflurane seems to be doing pretty well. So I don't know what the driving force is to replace it, because it would be incredibly expensive to do it.
I think I have the last question when we can continue outside. Someone had asked about the role of greenhouse gases from the various gases
Yeah,
used.
no, somebody sent in that question. We no longer use desflurane, which was a bad actor. We've taken all the vaporizers away. I don't know who uses it. And nitrous oxide is used to a much lower extent than it was when I was training, where everybody got nitrous oxide. So, you know, they're trying to reduce the gas wastage that is released into the atmosphere.
Great.
They're doing their part.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Jay. This has been a wonderful presentation.
Right. Thank you.